Megan Monchetti in Charlie State.
Our headlines today. A half-hearted approach that risks failing hundreds of thousands of pupils. The damning verdict of the government's top education advisor as he quits in a row over funding. Now, later today, we're expecting more information from the government on which countries UK holidaymakers can travel to without having to quarantine on their return. They'll be the ones on the green list, the so-called green list.
Let's speak to one of our regular GPs, Dr. Farid Ahmed, who joins us now from Wilmslow. Very good morning to you. So let's concentrate for a moment on the travel restrictions and potential changes. We don't find out until 5 o'clock this afternoon. There's quite a lot of speculation about this. I mean, people are interested, you know, it's the summer, and a lot more emphasis on personal responsibility. I'm just wondering what you're seeing in terms of people who are coming in to see you in the practice and the decisions they're making about how they're leading their lives.
Yeah. So I think, you know, throughout this, all these restrictions we've had that have, you know, increased and then reduced, a lot of it has actually come down to personal responsibility. Lots of people have, you know, taken it on board. You know, they hear what they need to do and they go ahead and they do it. And actually, if people didn't, you know, I think most of our restrictions wouldn't have had the impact they would have had. I think moving forward, it's interesting now that there is the thought of, you know, people stopping social distancing and stopping mask wearing. So I've certainly had discussions with people who are, you know, they are more vulnerable and they have a different view on it. I think they're less keen to do so. I've certainly had people who say, well, actually, you know, I think I probably will wear my mask because I do feel it keeps me less at risk. There are the other side of that, you know, that spectrum who say, well, you know, we should have stopped this weeks ago. And I think it will, in the end, become very personal and people's understanding of their own risk, the people they love, the people around them, how they're affected, and trying to get all of that in balance to find the right way for you to go forward.
Farid, can I just ask you, our lead story this morning is in connection with the funding for schools, extra funding, the so-called catch-up education funding. And I know one of the things a lot of medical practitioners are talking about, alongside the educational stuff, the idea of having tutors, is the real concern over young people and their mental health, you know, the stresses and strains on top of anxiety about their school, educational workload. What are you seeing?
So, you know, we've been seeing it for a while and it's certainly increasing. We're seeing a lot of mental health issues affecting, you know, children, school-age children. And, you know, I think you know, how the pandemic happened, how lockdown happened, it has had a massive impact on some of these children. And they are, you know, contacting us for help. I think the problem we're having is that the demand for, you know, places they could get help from is far exceeding the supply. And this has always been the case with mental health, even before the pandemic. And certainly this issue has become worse. I think it would be, you know, it would be a good place to concentrate, you know, resources on, is to help young people find ways to support their mental health, help parents and teachers support them, you know, seeing everything they've been through over the past, you know, year and a bit.
Farid, always good to catch up with you. Have a good day in the surgery. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Love the wave.
A little wave at the end.
There are exactly 50 days.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Good morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Megan Monchetti and Charlie State.
Our headlines today. A half-hearted approach that risks failing hundreds of thousands of pupils. The damning verdict of the government's top education advisor as he quits in a row over funding. Good morning. It's Thursday, the 3rd of June. Our top story is that the man appointed by Boris Johnson to help pupils in England make up for lost learning during the pandemic has resigned in a row over funding.
So Kevan Collins said the £1.4 billion allocated in the scheme fell far short of what was needed. Simon Jones has this report.
After months of classroom closures due to coronavirus, schools are now playing catch-up.
Excellent. And what's the word we would have?
But that will need extra cash. And the government's education recovery czar says there simply isn't enough of it. In a resignation statement, Sir Kevan Collins said he'd asked for landmark investment, but instead, ministers had chosen a plan that is too narrow, delivered too slowly. one that falls far short of what's needed. He adds, a half-hearted approach risks failing pupils.
The astonishing thing is that the Prime Minister hired him to do a job knowing the kind of report he would produce. When he produces it, the Prime Minister just throws his hand up and says no. It's really, really important to realise that there are parts of this country that will suffer because of this, because parts of the north of England have had schools that have been closed for double the amount of time that other parts of the country, particularly in the south, have done.
The government had announced an extra £1.4 billion over 3 years for tutoring and teacher training. Sir Kevan is reported to have wanted 10 times that.
This is not the end of announcements for what needs to be done to support this generation of young people. They've been through an immensely disruptive time, which has affected different children, different young people in different ways. And the government is committed, I believe, to doing what it takes to address that. We haven't yet had the comprehensive spending review. And when we do, we will hear more about what those plans are.
Put it here.
The government says it will continue to focus on education recovery to make sure no child is left behind with their learning, insisting more money is on the way. But Sir Kevan says what's on offer so far does not come close to meeting the scale of the challenge. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. Adam, morning to you. So when the Prime Minister is accused by a man he appointed just a few months ago of failing hundreds of thousands of children, there needs to be some response, doesn't there?
Well, Downing Street have thanked Sir Kevan for all his help with the Catch Up programme and pointed out that they've already committed £3 billion to tutoring and other measures, which is not an insignificant sum of money. It's just that for Sir Kevan, it's not significant enough. What this argument is about that has prompted his resignation isn't necessarily the tutoring programme or teacher training, which got extra money yesterday. It's that he wanted to extend the school day for all pupils in England. That would work out as an average of an extra half an hour a day. And that would be dedicated to what he calls enrichment activities. So extracurricular activities like sport and music and maybe a little bit of extra tutoring as well. However, the Treasury, who pay for all of this stuff or allocate the money for all of this stuff, said that they were not convinced by that case and they weren't convinced by doing it now. So that's now going to be the subject of a review, which will take a couple of weeks or a couple of months, which then raises the question, is Boris Johnson's flagship policy for the pandemic recovery, which is helping children to catch up with their lost learning, now kind of being held hostage or being taken control of by the Treasury? I'm not entirely sure that's the case because we don't really know if Boris Johnson is in favour of an extended school day or not. So we don't know if he's been prevented from getting that. But we do know he is obsessed about the tutoring programme and that got an extra £1 billion yesterday. So he is getting his way on that. So I think claims of a massive row between the government and the Treasury over a massive policy might be a little bit exaggerated, or at least they're exaggerated for now.
For now. OK, Adam, thanks very much. Adam Fleming there.
The organisers of the Tokyo Olympics have ruled out a cancellation.
Soon. Bye-bye.
Hello, this is Breakfast with Naga Manchetti and Charlie State.
Good morning to you. It's just after 7:30. Too narrow, too small, and will be delivered too slowly. The damning assessment of the government's new catch-up fund for pupils in England, made by the very man tasked with overseeing its rollout.
So Kevan Collins resigned yesterday after the money pledged for the scheme, £1.4 billion, fell far short of what he'd proposed.
Let's get reaction now from the chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, who joins us now. Robert Halfon, thanks very much for your time. I was just looking at your social media feed and you said to lose someone of the stature of Sir Kevan Collins is a real blow. Whilst today's catch-up money is hugely welcome to repair damage of school closures to improve attainment and outcomes for disadvantaged pupils, we need a properly resourced, radical, long-term plan and funding. This is what Kevan Collins was brought in a few months ago to do, wasn't it? And he hasn't been listened to. What do you think's happening?
Well, yesterday I thought that the overall amount of money, around £3 billion for extradition and catch-up, was a hefty starter from the government, as long as there was a main course. And Sir Kevan Collins clearly thought that there was no main course, and that is why he resigned. And it is a huge blow, because he is a serious individual with some serious ideas. And I think that the government need to ensure that education is a number one priority. Education needs to be considered alongside. And then there was, of course, there's always the question of funding. And I recognise that 400 billion has been spent on the pandemic and we're £1 trillion in debt, but the government found an extra 16 billion for defence. We're about to spend 800 million pounds on a new research agency, possibly 200 million pounds on a royal yacht to showcase business around the world. So if we can find money from the back of the Treasury sofa for those things, why on earth can't we find the right funding for a long-term plan for education? And it's got to be a radical long-term plan. We need to look at things like a longer school day, as Sir Kevan was proposing. We need to look at possibly cutting the summer holidays and reallocating the holidays over the year. And we need to look at the curriculum and prepare children for the world of work and undo the awful damage that children have faced over the past year because of not being at school.
What do you think this does in terms of a reflection on the government? Kevan Collins in March told an Education Select Committee that the 1.7 billion that had been pledged fell far short of what was needed. This isn't a surprise, is it?
Well, when he was appointed as an advisor, as I understand it, to Number 10 Downing Street, why appoint somebody of his stature, who the government respects? He was formerly head of the Education Endowment Foundation, which the government give a lot of money to carry out educational research. Why on earth appoint someone like that, ask him to do a plan, and then reject most of it? That I don't understand. And as I say, the damage of the last year has been enormous to children in terms of educational attainment, mental health, safeguarding hazards, their lifetime chances. There's statistic after statistic, and Sir Kevan mentioned that 200,000 children are below literacy levels. That's just one of these statistics. So we have to repair the damage of COVID. We have to reduce the attainment gap. So at the moment, there is disadvantaged pupils at 18 months behind better off pupils by the time they reach 16. We know that white working class boys and girls on free school meals underperform almost every other ethnic group at every stage of the education system. So there are big challenges facing schools. That's why the government needs to come up with a long-term plan. It's got to be properly funded. If the NHS can have a proper funding settlement and have a long-term plan.
Apologies for interrupting, but Kevan Collins came up with a plan that's needed now. And he said if something isn't done now, this problem, those children who have fallen behind are going to fall behind even further, and that attainment gap that you mentioned will widen even more. The government's been given a plan, doesn't want to hear it, doesn't want to spend the money on it. So what's the point of a long-term plan?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Sir Kevan has said, and he was setting out a plan. I think at the end of the day, the plan has got to come from the Prime Minister and the Education Secretary. Sir Kevan Collins is an advisor, but I agree, have a lot of sympathy with what he was trying to do, and we need that radical thinking. We need to make education as much of a priority as we do defence, health and the economy, and give it the support, the financial support, the muscle, the political will that it needs.
Tell me what you think, how you think this reflects on the Conservative Party, because one of the things that Kevan Collins said was in parts of the country where schools were closed for longer, such as the North, the impact of low skills on productivity is likely to be particularly severe. The Conservative Party built a lot of its base and support in the last election with the promise of levelling up. This is an obvious statement on the fact that without money, without this needed money, according to Kevan Collins, levelling up is not going to happen, at least for children.
Well, I was never a lockdown sceptic, but I was always a school down sceptic. And one of the reasons why I campaigned over the past year for schools to be kept open, even if everything else was shut down, was because I was worried about the damage to children. And Sir Kevan Collins and others have set out how stark that damage has been, especially to disadvantaged pupils, especially to those disadvantaged areas in the country. And that will be with us for months and years to come unless we act act quickly. So if levelling up is to mean anything, yes, the government has done some brilliant work on skills and lifetime learning. But if levelling up is to mean something really substantial, we have to have that long-term plan for education. Education has to be a core part of it, properly funded, properly supported, and real political will from the Treasury behind it.
Do you think this government has come out well after this?
Of course, when these things happen, it's not great. But to be fair to the government, as I mentioned in the beginning of this interview, they have put £3 billion for catch up and extra tuition, and that's not a sniff of money, that's serious money, and it should be welcome. There's 100 million extra hours of tuition. There's also hundreds of millions of pounds going into some holiday activities programme across the school holidays as well. So there's some good things the government have done. I'm just asking for real political will, real political muscle, that long-term plan, some radical thinking out of the box, and to make sure that it's properly resourced. And it's got to come sooner rather than later, because we need to ensure that we repair the damage to children over the past year.
I mean, you say it's a significant amount of money, £3 billion, certainly nothing to be sniffed at in terms of the real world. But what this extra funding, the 1.4 billion, amounts to £50 per pupil per year, which is a tenth of what Sir Kevan Collins has said was needed. So, I mean, we're always talking about big figures, aren't we? But it's what's needed. Now, as you as the chair of the Education Select Committee, what can you do about this now?
Well, I want to speak to my committee colleagues. I don't just make decisions without them, but I've been campaigning for a properly resourced and long-term plan for education for over 2 years now. In fact, we published a previous committee report asking for this before COVID. I can just continue to do that, to raise questions in Parliament, to have witnesses before committee. I hope that possibly we can ask Sir Kevan to come before the committee to set out the full details of the plan that he had proposed to the government. And what I can do as a committee chair is to lobby the government to make sure that education, there's real, as I say, real political muscle and will behind it. Because if we can find during COVID an extra £16.5 billion for defence, why on earth can't we find that extra money for education? If we can find money for tanks, why can't we find the extra funds that are needed for textbooks? So there has to be political will, and I hope that if Sir Kevan's resignation has done anything, it will really give impetus to the government to come up with that long-term plan for education.
Robert Halfon, Chair of the Education Select Committee, MP for Harlow, thank you very mich for joining us this morning on Breakfast.
See, time now is 7:40. It's time for the